Hello, and thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedules. I hope that there is something in here that you'll find of a value to you or to someone that you know. In my last stream, I mentioned what had changed in America over the past 30 years to cause some of the changes that are going on. The following story comes from American Heritage. It's an archived article from 1985, and the article is called The Battle of Athens. McMillan County, Tennessee is between Knoxville and Chattanooga. The big cities, some 50 miles away, had not yet begun their inevitable expansion. The farmers lived very simple lives and essentially unaffected by what they would call the modern world. Many of the farmers were without electricity. The Daily Post-Athenian, the local paper, which is still active today, told the people in the area something of the politics and war. But since it chose to avoid intrigue and scandal, a story that smacked of both could be found only on the conversations of the folks at the courthouse lawn on Saturdays. In the 1930s, Tennessee began to fall under the control of the Democratic bosses. I recommend you take a look at episode 19 I did, which talks about the starting of the Democratic Party. In 1936, the system descended upon McMillan County in the form of the person Paul Cantrell, the Democratic candidate for sheriff. Cantrell, who came from a family of money and influence in nearby Etowah, tied his campaign closely to the popularity of Roosevelt's administration and rode FDR's coattails to victory over his Republican opponent. The laws in Tennessee provided an opportunity for the unscrupulous to prosper, something I fear today. So the grift went like this. The sheriff and his deputies received a fee for every person they booked, incarcerated, and released. Deputies routinely boarded passing buses and dragged sleepy-eyed passengers to jail to pay the $16.50 fine for drunkenness, whether they were guilty or not. Arrests ran high as $115 per weekend. A voucher signed by the sheriff was all that was needed to collect money from the courthouse. The more human transactions they had, the more money they got. The fee system was profitable, but record-keeping was required, and they were not accountants. The money could also be traced. It was less troublesome to collect kickbacks for allowing roadhouses to operate openly. Cooperative owners would point out influential patrons. They were not bothered, but the rest were subject to shakedowns. Prostitution, liquor, and gambling were so prevalent that they'd become common knowledge in Tennessee that Athens was wide open. Encouraged by his initial success, in subsequent elections, Cantrell had ballot boxes collected from the precincts and the results tabulated in secret at the county jail in Athens. Opposition poll watchers were labeled as troublesome and ejected from the precinct house. That sounds a little too familiar. The 1940 election sent George Wood, a plump and affable Eton crony of Cantrell, to the state legislature. Wood promptly introduced an act to redistrict McMillan County. It reduced the number of voting precincts from 23 to 12 and cut down the number of justices of the peace from 14 to 7. Gerrymandering. Of those 7, 4 were openly Cantrell's men. When Governor Cooper signed Wood's bill into law on February 15, 1941, it effectively killed the Republican opposition in McMillan County. McMillan County Court, which was still dominated by Republicans, directed the county to purchase voting machines. The Cantrell Democrats countered by having Woods get a bill passed in Nashville abolishing the court and then selling the machines to save the county money. Department of Justice records show investigations of election fraud in McMillan County in 1940, 1942, and 1944. All without resolution. Again, oddly familiar. In the Second World War, 3,526 young men, or about 10% of McMillan's population, went off to fight. Most of those left behind, the elderly or perhaps more timid, contributed to Cantrell's machine growth by remaining silent. Still, as the war dragged on, people began to tell each other, wait until the GIs get back. Things will be different. In the summer of 1945, veterans began to return home. By 1946, the streets of Athens overflowed with uniforms, and Cantrell's forces were not worried. Bill White recalled coming home overseas with mustard pay in his pocket. There were several beer joints and honky-tonks around Athens, and they were pretty wild. We started having trouble with the law enforcement at that time because they started making it a habit of picking up GIs and fining them heavily for almost anything. They were kind of making a racket of it. After long, hard years of service, most of us were hardcore veterans of World War II. We were used to drinking our liquor and our beer without being molested. When these things happened, the GIs got madder. The more the GIs were arrested, the more that they got beat, the madder they got. At last, the veterans chose to use the most basic right of democracy for which they had gone to war, the right to vote. In the early months of 1946, they decided in secret meetings to field the slate of their own candidates for the August election. In May, they formed a nonpartisan political party. The main focus of the election centered on the race for sheriff between Knox Henry, who had served in the North African campaign, and Paul Cantrell. Since the 1936 election, Cantrell had gone on to the legislature as state senate and installed Pat Mansfield as sheriff in McMillan County. Mansfield had done very nicely for himself during his term in office. His 4 years as sheriff had netted him an estimate of $140,000. By now, in 1946, Cantrell was running for sheriff and Mansfield was for state senator. In the final weeks, a flurry of advertisement appeared in the Post-Athenian. Cantrell enumerated the accomplishments of the Democratic Party. Mansfield denied that the two men arrested on July 30th with a shipment of liquor were deputies, even though that they had admitted they were and had been delivering election whiskey. Cantrell warned that the veteran had printed sample ballots with the intention of stuffing the ballot box. The veterans offered a $1,000 reward for verifiable information about election fraud and repeated the slogan for weeks that sounded again and again from their camouflage loudspeakers. Your vote will be counted as cast. 2 days before the election, the GIs ran an advertisement in the Post-Athenian. These young men fought and won a war for good government. They know what it takes and what it means to have a clean government. They are energetic enough, honest enough, and intelligent enough to give us a good, clean government. A couple of pages further on, the Democrats had their say. Look at the facts, and you will vote for the Democrat ticket. The campaign fight is as old as the hills. It is the story of the outs wanting back in. The next day, the paper reported the veterans from Blount County had offered to come help watch the polls. Mansfield began building an army of his own. It has come to my attention, he announced, that certain elements intending to create a disturbance are at and around the polls. In order to see that law and order is maintained, I have several hundred deputies patrolling the county. He hired all of them from outside the county, some from outside the state. They would crowd inside every voting precinct, and they would be armed. August 1st, 1946 was Election Day. It found voters lined up early in the largest turnout in local history. Joining them were some 300 of Sheriff Mansfield's special deputies. Trouble began early. At 9:30 a.m., Walter Ellis, a legally appointed GI representative for the 1st Precinct in the courthouse, was arrested and jailed for protesting irregularities. The GIs began gathering on Washington Street, which served as the office of their campaign manager, Jim Bertram. He had seen action in Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. Above the door read a sign, phone 787 Jim Burton, the number to which voters were to report election fraud. As more than 200 GIs filled the small store, the somber mood of their leader told them that they were in trouble. He showed them copies of 2 telegrams dated July 22nd. One was addressed to the governor, Jim Cord, Nashville, Tennessee. The other to Attorney General Tom Clark, Washington, D.C. They requested assistance to ensure a fair election. Neither had been answered. Otto Kennedy, not an ex-GI himself, but a political advisor to the veterans, entered the office and announced that Cantrell had posted armed guards at each precinct. They all knew that this was a move in preparation of the 4 p.m. poll closing, when the ballot boxes would be moved to the jail for counting. A small group of veterans demanded an armed mobilization and called for a leader. Buttram declined, and so did Kennedy. But he did offer for them to use his SK garage and tire shop across the street from them as a meeting hall. The group crossed the street and held a meeting and agreed that those who did not have weapons should go get them and return as quickly as possible. By 3 p.m., most returned to muster at SK, and most were armed. At the same time, Tom Gillespie, an elderly black farmer from Union Road, stepped inside the 11th Precinct polling place in the Athens Waterworks on Jackson Street. Wendy Wise, a Cantrell guard, told Gillespie, N-word, "You can't vote here." When Tom protested, Wise struck him with brass knuckles. Gillespie dropped his ballot and ran for the door. Wise pulled a pistol and shot him in the back as he reached the sidewalk. This is where I want to point out that Cantrell and his deputies are the Democratic Party. The first shot of the day brought crowds streaming up from the courthouse. Sheriff Mansfield screeched to a halt at the waterworks, and the deputies loaded the bleeding Gillespie into the car. Mansfield ordered the precinct closed, posted 4 deputies outside to guard the waterworks, and then took Gillespie to jail. A dozen veterans from the auto shop started up toward the waterworks. They were unarmed. During the confusion following the shooting, the 2 GI poll watchers, Ed Vasto and Charles Scott, had been seized and held hostage inside the waterworks by Wise and another Cantrell deputy, Carl Neal. When the veterans reached the waterworks, the crowd began taunting the armed guards. As Wise and Neal stood at the windows and watched the angry crowd outside, Vestil and Scott plunged through the plate glass window and ran bleeding for the protection of the crowd. Wise stepped through the broken glass, waving his pistol. Several veterans rushed forward, but were quickly pulled back to safety. One of them shouted, "Let's go get our guns," and they left for the auto repair shop. In the meantime, Chief Deputy Bo Dunn had his men form a cordon from the building to the cruiser, and the ballot box was carried out to the car. Being aware of the threats by the GI, the chief deputy ordered the 2 men to the GI headquarters to arrest those who Wise could identify. The rest returned to the jail. When the 2 deputies reached the GI headquarters, they were disarmed and taken prisoner. So were 2 others that were sent as reinforcements. A crowd began to gather outside, and 3 more deputies came with pistols drawn, only to be pummeled and dragged inside. The crowd began to demand the lives of the captives, and some of the veterans agreed. This talk alarmed Odo Kennedy, and he left, vowing that he would take no part in murder. The crowd began to disperse, and most of the GIs left. Soon, a small nucleus of veterans were alone with the 7 hostages. The veterans took the hostages to the woods 10 miles out of town, beat them, and shackled them to trees. With that, I want to say thank you very much for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join me. I hope that there was something in here that you found of a benefit to you or to someone that you know. Please join me for my next episode for the conclusion of the Battle of Athens. United we stand, divided we fall. God bless you, and God bless America.